Hello. In this talk, we are going to explore further the three-step process, but we're going to focus more closely on the first piece of data gathering, which is going to be the data intelligence part. Now, as we mentioned in the previous discussion, the primary purpose of data intelligence is to collect facts from lots of different places and then transpose it into useful data, and this is data that can be consumed by other parts of the organization, like the analytics people or the managers in the BI section. So where does the DI people, where do they get their facts? Well, they can collect them from several different places. Now, the primary place is usually internal sources. Now, that would be things like, if you're a business, sales data, cost data. That would be things like, what's your electric bill, or the cost of, if you manufacture Twinkies, for example, it would be the cost of sugar and creamy filling that goes in the Twinkies, whatever. Customer data, you collect data about your customers over time. When they buy things, you usually ask them questions, and you can begin to develop a real good picture, a very clear picture of who's buying your product. Email that will come in is another good source of email of data for you, and it doesn't have to necessarily even be data that's coming in related to selling products or building products. You can even HR data, human resources data, data that you have on your employees can be very valuable. What makes a person a good salesperson? Is it a certain university? Is it a certain degree? Is it a certain quality, a grade point average, whatever? HR data is another good source. Transactional data, especially if you're a credit card company, that can be very useful as well. Where do people buy things, and how much do they spend, and how frequently do they buy? So that's so those are some of the internal sources, but you're not limited to just internal sources of collecting data. You can augment it with external data, and this particularly publicly available data. For example, every 10 years the government does a census on the people in the country, so that the government can begin to come up with a really good overview of various, like a zip code, and I can tell you if I'm the government, I can tell you the population of a certain zip code and what its demographic makeup is, and how much money these people make, and what their educational background is and their marital status. That can be very useful, because if I don't know much about you, if I just know you as a customer and I say you live in zip code 12345, I can draw a pretty good picture about you just from that demographic data, and then I can look around the country for demographic or for zip codes that look really similar. You could be in zip code 54321, but if your demographic profile is really similar to 12345, then guess what? That's a new segment. So some of these, and also you can get other things like weather data, for example. How much snow falls or something like that. This is kind of information that's publicly available, and just because it's free and the government's collecting it doesn't mean it's not valuable, and lots of organizations will collect that and fill up their databases with that as well. Also, there's third-party data that the DI people will also collect, and that usually is purchased from a vendor, and it has a very specific purpose. For example, Fair Isaac is a company that's noted for collecting credit data on people. What's the person's debt-to-income ratio, and how many times are they late on their credit card bills and things of that nature, and defaulted loans, etc. The Fair Isaac collects a very specific, now they do other things as well, but they're noted for very specific types of data that they collect from many sources, and they become a vendor of this type of data. So if you're a bank and you want to develop your own scorecards to figure out who's going to default on loans, you can go out there and collect data from Fair Isaac and build your scorecards that way. And of course, that's not just credit. There's companies like Axiom and Claritas that are noted for collecting very specific data on marketing purposes. For example, the type of magazines that perhaps you like to have, like if you're a person who likes to have Field and Stream magazine, you like to hunt and fish, they now know you're an outdoors person. Incidentally, those companies collect the data. Usually, one of the sources that they get it from is warranty cards. That's an interesting source. There's other places that they collect it, but in the past they used to collect it a lot with warranty cards. So you go and you buy a refrigerator and you fill out the warranty card, and then they ask you a couple of questions like, "Hey, by the way, do you get the Home and Garden magazine or Field and Stream or Sports Illustrated?" And you're like, well, why are they asking me that question? Well, what happens is these warranty card companies will sell that data to some of these data clearinghouses. I don't know if it's quite as popular as it used to be, because magazines are, with the internet, the magazine sales are beginning to decline. But that was one of the ways that this kind of data was collected, at least historically. But I'm sure they have new sources now, and it's a lot more internet based. Finally, there's data consortiums, and what a data consortium is when you have a lot of small companies that cannot collect enough data themselves, they pool their data. So if I have Fred's insurance company, for example, and he only has 1,000 customers, it's really hard to build a predictive model of who's going to crash their car based upon the small data set. So Fred's insurance company gets together with Mary's insurance company and Joe's insurance company, and they pool their data together, and then they share it. So everybody's allowed to withdraw from the data set and build their own predictive models. Now, larger companies also do it, just because it tends to be more geared towards small companies that need to pool their data. But large companies will do it as well, because the more data you have, the better. Data storage, let's talk about that. Once you've collected the data, you've collected all these facts, and then you want to put it someplace, usually the data is stored in a relational database, and that's a logical way of storing the facts that you are collecting, and it allows people to pull out the data that you've collected in a logical format, so you can have a relational database. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in another video on what a relational database is. However, what it will allow you to do is, if I have this database, I can say, I have a table of people, and I know their income and where they live, and so now I can pull out people who make $100,000 a year from Ohio. It allows the rest of the organization to get exactly the type of data that they want, and it's right there at their fingertips. Over time, large data sets are becoming more of an issue for corporations, because of the amount of data doubles every 2 years, or at least that's a theory, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest it may not be that exact amount, but there's a lot. The amount of data that is being produced in the world is growing at phenomenal rates. So old databases that you used to have on your PC that would serve a company just fine, those databases no longer are adequate enough. So now the DI people, one of their jobs is to figure out how can they store large amounts of data and be able to access it quickly. Another function of the DI people is they have to be able to subset data. Many times one of their roles is they will create a data warehouse. And a data warehouse is typically a small subset of the data that is put together in a database for a very specific purpose. Like the marketing people, rather than have to sift through hundreds of data tables and look for exactly what they want every time, the DI people will do all that subsetting for them, and then they'll have a very specific data set, database just for them that will constantly update for it will constantly be updated. When the main database updates, the data warehouse will update as well. So those are how data is typically stored. Now, other functions of the DI world, or the data intelligence people, is one thing that it's their responsibility to do is backing up and archiving data. There's really two reasons for this. One is that obviously if your database goes down, data is valuable stuff. It's raw material that companies use to turn into money. It's valuable stuff, and if your database goes down, you're in trouble. So usually the DI people will back up the data and store it off-site. Also, they will archive it, even though, and it's not just a backup, but after a data becomes not used anymore, like let's say that person's loan history after about 10 years might not be as relevant, you still want to archive it and put it off-site. And you might want to, because you never know when you might need this, but you might want to start doing some kind of a trend analysis to look at loan defaults over the last 20 years. You'll have that data that you can go back to. So archiving the data is another function of the DI world. Also, there are sometimes legal requirements. For example, if you're in a certain industries like insurance, where they constantly are being sued by law firms in class action lawsuits, one of the things that happens is in the discovery process, the lawyers will say, hey, I want all your old emails for the last 5 years. And now a lot of these corporations are required to back up, let's say, email exchanges for a certain amount of time. So you have legal requirements to back up data. So that's another function of data intelligence. Another thing that they constantly need to do is to look for new sources of data and anticipate what the organization is going to need. A good example like this would be map data. In the past, let's say the late 1990s, the early 2000s, data related to position was not really easily consumed. The software that did it, that was able to map, was very expensive, it was slow, and it was hard to turn that kind of data into numeric data that you could put into a predictive model. So it wasn't really all that useful. However, over time, the software that got to do this became more and more sophisticated. It was able to, mapping software, you can download something off of the internet that will do some really nice mapping that's actually free, or it's shareware. So this is another, so the DI people, one of their jobs would be to watch the technology and realize this data is growing and it's becoming more usable. It may not have been usable in the year 1999, but in the year 2016, it's very usable and very relevant. So you do not want to, as a DI person, to be in a situation where the analytics guys or the BI guys show up at your doorstep and say, hey, I need some positional data to do some analysis, and you can't give them a blank stare and say, oh, wow, let me look into that. You have to be ahead of the game or ahead of the curve on that. And a final function that the DI world has, and we're going to talk about this throughout the course, is executing predictive models from the analytics team. Now, again, this is a very generic way of looking at organizational intelligence, and not every DI organization in every company is in charge of executing the predictive models. However, this is typically a function that's given to them. The analytics guys will build a predictive model, for example, that predicts attrition, who's going to leave. They build a scoring program, and that will typically get put back in and run right in a database, so that, let's say, every month the database guys will push a button and that will run the attrition model, and they'll score the entire database of customers, and then you'll sort it and you'll say, okay, these 500 people have a very high probability of leaving, and then maybe they'll merge it in with their customer value of the person, and they'll say, well, these guys are leaving, and by the way, of these 500, these top 10 are worth $1 million, so let's call them up and try to save them. So this is a function that the data intelligence people do because the data is at their fingertips. So those are some of the functions of the DI world, and we'll go into functions in further talks of the analytics world and also the BI world.